of your pressing questions might be, what kind of risks am I risking if I use cannabis and put it into my body? There's been so much bad hype about it. And it's considered a drug of abuse federally, so there must be a reason for that, right? The Institute of Medicine, which is a reviewing institute for medical practices, did a report, well over 10 years ago, where they found that except for smoking, the risks associated with cannabis use are not above or even less than those tolerated for other medications. So we actually know that the risks are smaller than expected for a lot of pharmaceuticals. Having said that, meaning that it's safer than a lot of the drugs you're taking, and that it's not a drug of abuse, let's look into what the risks might be. The first thing that comes up is toxicity, which happens with some medications. There's actually an amount of medicine that you can take that will actually be damaging to your body. Like too much medicine can cause liver failure or kidney failure or toxic syndrome or even death. Do any of those negative effects happen with cannabis use up to the highest amounts anybody could ever possibly get into their body? And the answer is no, 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 and no. There's no liver damage, there's no kidney damage, there's no long-standing toxic effect damage, and there's no lethal dose, and there's never been a death associated to overdose of cannabis. So that's one risk we don't have to worry about. There are some risks, though, that do happen. The first one that comes to mind is if you have THC-rich cannabis, and I'm going to say this every time because the risks of cannabis use are every single one of them, generated from THC-rich cannabis use. There's never been a risk associated with CBD-rich cannabis use. So if you're using mostly CBD, none of this applies to you, none. So the first risk with THC-rich cannabis is impaired driving. And as a matter of fact, that's the only legal problem with using cannabis. If it's legally allowed in your state, you're following the laws, you're still not allowed to drive while under the influence of cannabis. The risk of doing long-term cognitive or developmental damage to your neurobehavioral system, which is why cannabis is generally considered to be safe for people over 21 and questionable in people under 21 because their nervous systems are still developing. And while cannabis does bind to nervous system receptors, it's not really been proven that it does any long-term damage. So you do see changes in the brains of people who are chronic cannabis users. Short-term ability to coordinate activities. You might be able to do one project really well, but to multitask, maybe not so good. Which is why cannabis is actually really useful for ADHD, because it helps people be able to narrow the range of activities that they're going to be having going on simultaneously, kind of narrow the framework, which is a change. I don't know if it's a bad change, it's a change. And then we have to talk about physiological short-term effects like possibly increased heart rate or heart palpitations or nervousness. Those are acute effects for naive users who are new to cannabis that once you use it regularly as your medicine, you will not feel. But it is definitely something to consider. You might feel your heart pounding faster if you use cannabis for the first time. Then we get to the biggest risk that's associated with cannabis use, and that's smoking. And that's actually was a really valid risk that they touted for 50 years until all these other delivery methods became available. But in truth, you don't have to smoke cannabis. Really, if you do smoke cannabis, which is not a medically preferred method, but if you do, They actually showed that there's no increased risk for lung cancer or head and neck cancer. So what you're risking is a chronic cough, bronchitis, wheeze, increased sputum, all the things that come from increased smoke. The kind of tar and petrochemical risk that happens when you smoke anything. So the way to deal with that is to really minimize smoking cannabis. If for some reason you're going to smoke it, they found in a study that your risk of getting pulmonary complications only happened after you smoked a joint a day for 7 years or more. So if for some reason you want to smoke, if you can keep your smoking down to a joint a day for 7 years, you don't even get into these cough complication, bronchitis risk things. And that's really smart because you can actually mix your smoking with vaporizing, or you can add some concentrate to your smoking setup. You can use a water pipe. You can do all kinds of things to lower your tolerance, to keep your smoking usage down to less than a joint a day.